Uh, Today we are getting a seminar by Dr. Dan Krauschek, who currently works at Sandia National Laboratories. So Dr. Krofcheck is a complex systems scientist and an ecophysiologist who studies systems interactions in high consequence settings. He received his undergraduate degree in chemistry and environmental studies at Ohio Wesleyan University, followed by his PhD in biology at the University of New Mexico, working with Dr. Marcy Litvak. Dr. Krofcheck's fire ecology experience began shortly after that at UNM, working with Dr. Matthew Hertel. He is especially interested in how synoptic stresses can affect landscapes in nonlinear ways, affording heterogeneous responses to homogeneous drivers. These kind of interactions are typically poorly described in Earth systems and landscape process models, yet we're relying on modeling to help us make decisions about how to interact with the natural world in the future. And so this way of thinking has gotten Dr. Krofcheck excited about coupled human natural systems, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. And so without taking any more of your time, Dan, I'm going to hand the floor over to you. And yeah, you can share your screen and we'll let you know if it's working.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
Here we go.
Yeah, thanks for that. I
Sure.
I didn't mean to give you such a long bio after read in front of people. I sort of got carried away. So you have to apologize. I'm a little bit sick. My wife's a nurse. We're both fully vaccinated, but she got COVID probably at work, taking care of critical care COVID patients. My guess is I have it too. I'm getting a test tomorrow. So just kind of modern living, I guess, but I'm happy that I can still give this talk from the comfort of my isolated house. So I'll be talking to you today about modeling wildfire and fuels mitigation in Southwestern ecosystems, and I want to try to focus on this notion of coupled complex systems. It's not necessarily what the paper's focused on, right? And my reasoning or interest behind that have to do with the fact that I now wear a couple of hats. So I work as a research professor, assistant research professor at UNM, and I also work at Sandia National Labs. And at Sandia, I do a lot of complex systems modeling. So what I'm hoping to do is step through kind of some background and framing for why wildfire is important. I'm not going to belabor this too much because I'm talking to the fire lab. But I do want to sort of highlight some of the things from AR6 and some contemporary framings for fire and coupled systems and why it's the thing we should be focusing effort on. I want to also talk a little bit about what the impacts of wildfire are on adjacent complex systems. So other societal frameworks that could benefit from this kind of analysis. Most of the work that I've done in this field has leveraged the notion of the probability of high severity fire as kind of a way to optimize some treatment regime. It's basically an objective function target. I'll describe that, how we came to that conclusion. Landis is the simulation framework we've primarily used, so I'm going to describe how Landis works and what's required to get it spun up. And then instead of stepping through the results from these pubs, I thought it'd be more interesting to kind of step through the thought process behind designing the landscapes in the modeling context and executing some of these research questions all the way through to characterizing kind of the broad sort of synoptic high-level patterns of results. But hopefully it's a useful framework, and I'm happy to talk about any aspect of this, after today or later on too. So take notes and hit me with questions. So to start the framing, I mean, we know that the Mountain West and the Sierras are essentially on a tipping point of natural disaster when it comes to wildfire. It's kind of unfortunate that this is the case, but it's sort of the perfect storm, right? We know that decreases in snowpack, significant deviations from long-term norms, are keeping a lot of moisture out of systems that really need it to function well the following summer and fall. There's also been a consistent and near linear trend of increased fire frequency across most mountain systems in the Western US. And so that's been happening since about the 80s or so. And we know that climate change is the primary driver behind this forest fire growth. And recently, we've been able to actually characterize and apply attribution towards the fact that human-caused climate change is due to a specific portion of that, right? So now we finally have a way to sort of put a number on this. And over the range of 84 to 2015, they're ballparking about 4.2 million hectares of forest fire are due to the human-caused component of changing climate. And this is, interesting in the context of charismatic megafire, where you have these events that garner so much media coverage because they're simply massive. Excuse me. And because they're so large, there tends to be an increased intersection between the wildland-urban interface and fire in general. And this is just an infographic that shows, the area burned in California's Camp Fire overlaid on top of Chicago, to kind of put the context or put the scale in context. This is mostly for folks that don't have an understanding of what 150, 160,000 hectares looks like. And so these linear increases in wildfire are so severe that we can kind of characterize it in terms of numbers that folks can wrap their head around. So we can say things like, since 2015, there's been about 100 more large wildfires per year, every year since the year before. I mean, these massive increases are difficult to ignore, and they have large consequences for all forest regions, but especially sensitive regions are kind of high elevations in areas like the Sierras, for instance. There's been about 1,000% increase since 1984. And just over a 7-year period, so 01 to 08, they estimated about 18 or so teragrams teragrams of carbon per year were emitted just due to those wildfire emissions. And so the increases in aridity that we've been seeing over the last 30 to 50 years has exposed a huge amount of fire that wouldn't traditionally be available to burn across the Western US. And so we're seeing an increased size, frequency, and availability and fire severity across that whole region. And even if you don't take into account, or rather, even if you take into account the fact that fuel stationarity is not something that we can assume. So this is the idea that if you burn over a large stand of trees, for instance, and then burn over it again and again, every time it burns, there's less biomass, the burn's going to happen differently, and we should have less carbon dioxide emitted as a function of that repeat. There's still a significant increase in the area burned per year. That's what our projections are coming out to, at least. And so we're looking at like roughly one rim fire's worth of emissions every 4 or so years through late century, which is a huge amount of carbon, 240 teragrams of CO2 potentially emitted during that period. And if you couple that with the fact that wildfire smoke in the West accounts for about half of all PM 2.5, so the particulate matter in that size class that's emitted and that people have to deal with, then suddenly you're talking about all wildfires being directly coupled to the healthcare system, right? I mean, you're basically looking at the number of people who are subjected to PM 2.5 concentrations. That's going to increase their likelihood of suffering some kind of respiratory related ailment. And actually, a lot of recent work has shown that there's near linear concentration or linear relationships between PM 2.5 annual average exposure and mortality. So another way to frame that for folks who want to talk about dollars instead is it increases the burden on the healthcare system. It makes healthcare cost, so over the period of 2012 to 2018, healthcare quadrupled in cost. So there are a bunch of ways to look at the consequences of wildfire affecting human well-being, but just thinking about the transport of particulate matter as having a direct impact on mortality and healthcare costs is an interesting perspective. It's an easy one to add to most modeling scenarios, especially if you can get coupled up with folks that do some kind of global transport modeling, which would be pretty cool. We also know there's a significant impact that wildfires have on the supply of municipal water. Wildfire directly impacts watersheds through kind of primary and then secondary consequences of fire. We know that, as vegetation is denuded across hill slopes and valleys due to wildfire, following precipitation events, they're going to cause like landslides, erosion. All that material is going to load into streams and riparian systems, aquifers, and result in eutrophication potentially, where you have a bunch of organic material that's just going to decompose and create these anoxic conditions and potentially produce algal blooms, et cetera. These are all burdens that municipal sources or like processing plants that rely on that water have to deal with. And in many cases, actually in most cases, the systems models that these communities use to estimate how much water they have available, they assume kind of a heavy side supply. So that fresh water coming into the city is never really changing. And if you guys live in the West, that's an assumption that's getting a lot of scrutiny these days, and for good measure. If you pair on top of that the fact that we have this complex interaction between forest fire and the allocation of a wide variety of toxins into the riparian system and subsequent aquifers, it gets worse. There's been work that characterized the flux of volatile organic compounds like benzene, for instance, into these systems. And benzene is not something you want to be drinking. It's kind of like related to things like stilbene derivatives and bisphenol A, and they're all kind of things you don't want to mess with. And when you burn structures, you burn infrastructure, pipes, et cetera, all of that is just going to flow downstream and will have to be filtered out of water. A lot of it can't be filtered out, and it persists for months following fires. This figure in the bottom right just shows, I don't want to talk about it too much, but it's just showing kind of the concentration, in this case, of benzene as a function of months since two fires, the tub fire and the camp fire. And you notice that it's not kind of a gradual decrease in the concentration. There are pulse dynamics, there are lags. So these are things that aren't that aren't well characterized. And the primary drivers of all these dynamics are, wildfire interacting complex terrain and then affecting watersheds. So, this means that because wildfire has consequences for all these adjacent systems, things like ecosystem services, recovered respiratory health and watershed health, the resilience of the electric grid, even things like emergency response and emergency logistics, right? Like how do you mobilize huge amounts of people from around the country, take them away from their current role, and then put them kind of in this massive charismatic megafires zone? That's a big deal. And groups like FEMA struggle with that kind of thing. You also have interesting perspectives on economics. So understanding how the housing market's going to respond to areas that are around the WUI, looking at people's insurance rates, et cetera. And all of these, again, are systems that can be driven by a relatively simple wildfire kind of modeling analysis. But the nice thing is that we know that management intervention for fuels can affect wildfire consequences, right? And that means that management intervention for wildfire fuels and for forest fuels can also have direct impacts on all these adjacent systems that we're covering. So if you think about managements or treatments as increasing the stability of a system or the resilience of a forest, right? Oftentimes we'll characterize it. This is stuff that I've talked about, and lots of folks before me have talked about, looking at this investment perspective of forest management. So a short-term cost for long-term gain and stability. You can build capacity now for a system that may not have any problems, but that we expect to have instability in the future. And you can really just take this old school kind of hauling, perspective of resilience, and it's still, I love it. I think it's a fantastic way to think about these things. We can either build resilience into these systems, or we can try and find ways to structure adaptive capacity in the system to handle with subsequent sort of future unforeseen challenges. The only problem with thinking about how you model a wildfire kind of framework with the goal of having it be directly applicable to its adjacent systems is kind of, what are the modeling hooks? Like, what's the thing that people that study municipal water are going to care about that you can give them by studying or by modeling wildfire? And so if you can handle that, then you're in a good spot to start collaborating with folks that do a bunch of different other things. And one of the things that I've used that I think has consequences to a lot of other groups, and this is probably the low-hanging fruit, is looking at the probability of high severity fire. And so it's a desirable target as an objective function because climate and disturbance affect it. We know that management intervention reduces it almost directly. We know that we can measure it empirically and we can model it more or less. And so we just need a simulation platform that's going to give us the ability to grow, stress, and then kill vegetation, have it undergo succession over long time horizons, like 20 to 50 to 100 years, and be able to drive that with contemporary and projections of future weather. We also need ways to think about a fire model and fuels integration, and finally, some kind of management hooks that let us do things like, remove the basal area in some region or put RX fire onto the ground, that kind of thing. And these aren't big asks, right? There are a lot of programs that do this kind of thing. So not talking about Landis right now, I think in general, whenever I approach these kinds of modeling problems, even if it's not necessarily related to fire, I tend to take a relatively structured perspective, and I'll run through it quickly because I know this is probably how most of us think, but you try and simplify the system as much as you can into a more or less simple, not coupled state where you've got a single cell running in isolation, and you add complexity through components, whether you're adding species onto a landscape, or you're adding generators in a power grid. You just need to find a way to slowly build the level of complexity that you think simulates or, I guess, well reflects your system. Now, in the case of ecosystem physiology type models, I always turn to Eddy Covariance as a validation target. So for those that aren't familiar, Eddy Covariance is a micrometeorological technique that pairs an infrared gas analyzer with a sonic measurement of wind direction and speed. And you just look at the flux of carbon dioxide and water vapor. And through measuring all of those kind of fluxes over some period of time, you can get at how much photosynthesis and respiration a landscape is doing. And so if your model is trying to simulate these processes for a variety of individual species or cohorts, you won't necessarily know how to disaggregate the error that you're getting, but you can kind of pass the sniff test and see if you're on the right track in terms of understanding how the system as a whole is functioning. Through a lot of ecosystem parameterization, probably starting at the species level, you end up with a parameterized landscape. And once you've got this thing you can do stuff with, you're just off to the races as a modeler. So in order to try and characterize the probability of high severity fire in these systems, the initial strategy is really basic. It's to take that parameterized landscape that you've developed and just expose it to ensemble members of some kind of climate projection. So you can get, estimates of temperature, relative humidity, precipitation, et cetera, out to 2100 or so from collections like CMIP5. I believe CMIP6 is out, but I haven't messed with it yet. And you can get all of these models to drive your landscape. You can run stochastic ignitions across your landscape, and you can sort of scatter the locations where fires ought to occur. It's kind of commonly done. And what I do is I'll typically like to think about the upper bound of those events. So I'll make sure that every fire that succeeds propagates under the most extreme weather conditions for fire. And to do this, we're kind of getting an upper bound on what we expect the fire severity for that landscape to be if the grid cells burn. So then the goal is to look at that through the lens of, all right, what's the likelihood that each grid cell burns above some specific fire severity threshold? Can we characterize that as a probability so we can look at the landscape and say, these are the areas where if things are real bad, we know it's going to burn really hot, right? That's the kind of thing you can ask questions with and drive decision-making with. So once we have that objective function, the probability of high severity fire, right, we can do things like understand how the implemented management solutions that we're generating compare to each other and compare to like a do nothing kind of scenario. And we have a way to ask questions about how well our management implementation is actually reducing the likelihood that the landscape burns at some high severity state. And so you can kind of think of it as a way to characterize landscape vulnerability to high severity fire. And that can be used to drive a variety of optimization targets if you're thinking about where to apply fuels management, when, those sorts of things. And hopefully, if you show a map of that kind of thing to someone that has subject matter expertise about the area and they think about fire a lot, if they squint, they might say, yeah, that actually kind of makes sense. And that's kind of like a very reassuring thing. It's never good when people look at you sideways and they basically live and work in those areas. But you also got to make sure that, you convince folks that just because your map says that this grid cell has high severity fire, very high likelihood, that doesn't mean they should go spend all their time and investments in that area, right? This is These are models, they're rather poor characterizations of reality. And I think we got to find ways to kind of walk that line when we communicate the results to managers and decision makers to make sure that they take away the right information from the consequences of these outcomes. Okay, so then how do we do that in an actual simulation framework, like a real existing framework, not just some conceptual mess? I use Landis, and that's primarily what I've used, but I know that there are a few other options out there that I think meet all the requirements that I've laid out. Landis is spatially explicit. It's a process-based model, so vegetation can grow, reproduce, compete for light, nutrients, and water, and then dies. We don't track individuals. You track cohorts of individuals by age and species. And you can expose the landscape with these cohorts of individuals to all varieties of stresses and manipulations, insects, harvests, fire, and wind throw. And Landis is kind of a modular framework, so you can swap out the thing that does fire with a different version of a different thing. Same with harvest and management. And for one of the papers that I'll talk about today, I used an extension in Landis called PNet, which is named after an existing photosynthesis model. It's photosynthesis and net evapotranspiration. This has a bit more functionality than how the base Landis characterizes vegetation growth and water use, but the nuance there won't really affect things we'll talk about. But I do want to mention that PNet's pretty cool. It's got some problems, but if what you care about has to do with species-specific plant plant physiological traits, it's an interesting thing to look at. So PNet treats every tree kind of like a big leaf, and it does photosynthesis during the day, and respiration happens both at day and night. You can do things like allocate carbon between stems and leaves. You can get at drought tolerance and light use characteristics. These are all species-specific relationships. In fact, there's a structural component to the canopy, and this is the main reason I wanted to bring this up to this audience. If you care about understanding how, say, the prevalence of shade-tolerant species, maybe in systems where the fire return interval has kind of lapsed many times, and you're getting things pop up that wouldn't typically be there if fire touched that landscape more often. Typically in a model like this, you'd have to kind of classify things to say that this species is more or less shade tolerant, maybe a scale of like 1 to 5 or something. But what you're doing right now with PNet is you can actually give it light use characteristics, the half saturation rate of photosynthesis, things that are kind of leaf level plant physiology-esque that end up telling you how well that plant will deal with light and how much of its maximum photosynthetic rate it can get to with a certain amount of light that it has given its place in the canopy. So a lot of these things can kind of come out in almost like an emergent manner, which can be nice depending on the questions that you want to ask. So just to run down some of the parameters that we have to deal with here and seek out in the lit or tune with the modeling community. And this is a huge amount of time spent here, but I'll cover it quickly. Keeping in mind that we're talking about species-specific characteristics for trees, and then shrubs are typically some kind of plant functional type, like resprouter or nitrogen fixer, that kind of thing. So Landis has demographic parameters, maximum age, reproductive age, dispersal distance, and then the PNet extension has a bunch of additional parameters. So leaf weight, foliar nitrogen give you things like leaf area and growth rates in the model. And then functional parameters like water use efficiency and the half saturation of photosynthesis can tell you about drought and shade tolerance. So this is the reason why we chose PNet was to get at kind of some of the nuances that occur in Southwestern landscapes where, trees are dying, whether it's because they're too hot or too dry. You'll get different takes on that, whether it's beetles or hydraulic failure. The fact is that the trees are dying, and we wanted a way to simulate that that kind of was driven primarily by climate. So then thinking about how we execute this strategy in step 2 using Landis on 2 seemingly pretty dissimilar landscapes. I want to try to make the claim here, though, that they're actually very similar, and the way that we approach modeling both of these systems is very similar. And even the questions we asked were very, very, very similar. So on the left, the Santa Fe Watershed in northern New Mexico. This is a place where I recreate. It's very near and dear to my heart. It's beautiful up there. It's a mixture of pinyon juniper woodlands, ponderosa pine, and mixed conifer and subalpine stuff at higher elevations. It's pretty much only governed by an elevation gradient to drive all of that variability. And the fire shed's about 45,000 hectares. It encapsulates, I think it's about a 7,000 hectare watershed that provides all of it, the municipal water for Santa Fe. Kind of a big deal. And it's significantly past its fire return interval almost everywhere. It's just really thick in there and overgrown. So we're trying to get in there and shape it up. On the right-hand side, it's the Dinky Creek watershed, a much larger landscape, almost 90,000 hectares. It's pretty iconic up there, a lot of old growth stuff, way more biomass on the landscape, much more complex terrain, huge trees. Going out there, being from living as long as I have in the Southwest and going out, my dissertation was on pinyon juniper woodlands. And if you start going out to like forests in the Sierras, it's awe-inspiring. So fun to work in both of these places. Luckily, I got to go and not just sit behind a computer and model them. So the adaptive gradient in the complex terrain area like Dinky is also pretty important. So looking at diversity of soils and parent rock material and that kind of thing. But again, elevation governs most of that climate distribution. So I'm going to speak briefly about how we characterize ecoregions in these landscapes. And that's kind of a thing that Landis required. I think now it's sort of past that as the more contemporary version, but basically regions of the landscape that are adaptively and climatically similar. I'll look at species distribution and how we characterize that. And then finally talk about fire size distributions and the data-driven approach I've used. I'm not going to talk about growth and succession weather because it's more or less an off-the-shelf kind of solution. Fire weather, same kind of thing with raw stations and weather stations you can generate or model fire weather. The fuels parameterization in itself would be a whole other talk, and I'd be happy to dive into that offline later on, but I'm going to skip it for now because it's kind of in the weeds for what I want to talk about. So the climatic and adaptive variability, this notion of generating ecoregions is pretty important for a model like Landis. I think in general, it's a nice way to try and reduce the complexity of the model, right? This notion of a tension between complexity and parsimony should always be in the back of your mind when you're trying to figure out a way to model a system like this. And in order to make it sufficiently complex, all we really have to do here is capture the diversity in climate across both of these systems. And since they're primarily on directional ridges, we can almost use elevation as a surrogate for climate, knowing that there will be variability in that due to slope and aspect, slope position, et cetera. The adaptive gradient, driven by, again, primarily parent rock materials, seems to do the trick in both of these systems, is kind of an important surrogate for a wide variety of other things like water holding capacity, nutrient availability. But still, there's a lot of variability in that because of topography. So if we use elevation as a surrogate for climate, you can also use things like climate tiles. If your landscape is just massive, other efforts have done this, like some of the work that Matt and Schwang have done have kind of shown the, Herto et al. And Schwang et al. Have kind of shown the use of a climate tile as a surrogate for an ecoregion because they're just so large. The grid cell size is so large that it's not worth diving into the nuance of how topography within that grid cell affects things. On the other end of things, you might have landscapes like in the Southeast. I've done some work in northern Florida where there's almost no topographic variability, but people that work down there will say, no, it's huge. There's almost like a couple inches over here. Look, it's massive. And what they actually mean is that the couple inch difference in elevation is the difference between kind of a drier, pine flatwood and like a bog, basically. And those are very different edaphic systems. But climatically, there's almost no variation across the entire system. So again, knowing the system and getting out there is kind of critical, but these are the choices that we made here. I just do a really simple geospatial join of sorts and just look at where elevation and soil are distinct, split them up as kind of zonal structure and go from there. So characterizing species across the landscape, this is also kind of a tricky thing to do, but there are some fairly established ways to do it now. And the goal is to give your model a good understanding of what current conditions are. Now, the previous versions of Landis, for instance, would have you spin up the landscape and try to achieve current state after some number of years of growth and succession. I think the current version where you basically specify the biomass in every grid cell of every species and cohort age. How are we going to do it? If you need to make a map of the composition of species across the landscape, forest inventory analysis and imputation with something like random forest is quick and easy. FIA plots have problems, but they're not insurmountable. Leveraging remote sensing products from Google Earth Engine, like on the left here is a tassel cap transform from Landsat 8, that basically shows a combination of the albedo, the vegetation content, and how much water there is on the surface of every grid cell. You pair that with some other raster layers like slope position, aspect, elevation, and suddenly you can start to sort of paint by numbers to assign species and age distributions from FIA plots to every grid cell on your landscape. This is what I've done for the last like 5 years, and I'm doing it again now, and it hasn't really changed. There are some products out there that are being developed that look to have some promise, but this way I can still have full control over the process and not being given a map. Pretty soon though, I hope these will become standard products that researchers can leverage and just take off the shelf and use. I don't think we're there quite yet, and characterizing uncertainty in this setting is a big deal and still something we have to sort out as a community, but we're getting there. So if this isn't something that you're familiar with, or folks that you work with aren't, again, I'm happy to even offer code, things to help simplify the process, because it's such a daunting task, and it shouldn't be. The fire size distribution across these landscapes is also something we got to pin down. This is probably the easiest thing to do, especially in areas like California where they have such good geospatial data. So on the left here is a collection of shapefiles of fire perimeters colored by the year that they occurred for an area in the Sierras. And so from that, we can generate a distribution just by fitting some kind of log normal fit to a histogram of events based on fire size. And we can characterize that distribution in terms of its mean and its standard deviation or its variance. And suddenly we have, a data product that we can then draw from when we want to ask the question, how big is a fire likely to be if we have a fire? Now, hopefully, this should be like a max size thing because the fuel process on the ground should govern fire size, but this is how this model works. And so it's something we had to do. I want to point out too that in almost every model that I've seen so far and that I've used, attempted ignitions are not the same thing as fires. So you typically need to tune the ignitions on the landscape to match the number of fires that you expect to occur given historical data. And that's always feels like using a magic 8-ball just to make sure the model is producing the right thing. But it's one of those things that I haven't quite wrapped my head around. And you can always crank up the ignitions in the model and make sure that you get the right number of fires occurring per year that the evidence would suggest is what you want to see. And that's the approach that I've taken. So then once we have all those bits, we can basically generate a probability of high severity fire map. And this is as simple as, again, running a bunch of replicate simulations with stochastic fires, and then taking the rasters that you get as output, so the number of fires per year across all your replicates, taking the mean of that, and counting the number of total fires per grid cell. So that's what we have here on the left-hand side of both of these plots. Again, the Santa Fe is on top and the Dinky Creek is on the bottom. And you have the total number of fires. You can bin that or just kind of threshold it by those that are only high severity. And then just calculate a probability for any given grid cell that if you were to draw a fire from that grid cell, what's the likelihood that it's above some certain severity threshold? Now, in Landis, severity is a binned thing, like 1 through 5. There's a lot of ways to kind of construe fire model output as severity, right? And I think that we all kind of can think of ways to do that. I chose partial and full crown fire kind of as a high severity fire, because typically that's the case. This is also where, if you have a knowledge of the system or you have an SME or you've been out there, you can kind of look and ask the question, does this make sense given we know of the system? Would you expect high severity fire to rip through here? And you can contrast the Santa Fe fire shed, where the whole thing would burn at high severity for the most part, except for the really high elevation and some of the canyons and low elevation. There was not much biomass, with the much more diverse patchwork in the Sierras. But again, there's a likelihood of high severity fire, almost everywhere. So then how do we leverage that when we ask questions about characterizing management scenarios? And man, I mean, generating management scenarios in a modeling context is a huge pain. There's just no way around it. I think this is a really big challenge. A lot of the time is spent here figuring out what to do. My strategy for both of these landscapes was to ask questions about how well we can do if we optimize treatments based on this probability of high severity fire, compared to kind of a naive approach where we don't optimize treatments and we sort of just treat everything in a scenario where we basically do nothing. And you start to have to really cut up your landscape into a lot of different bits. So on the top here, actually in both cases, but in the top, I'll just talk about that first. The first thing we have to do is think about where in the landscape you can actually get in to do mechanical thinning, since a lot of these mountainous areas, they're precluded from using machinery to thin vegetation. So if slope is greater than some certain threshold, it's just off the table. For thinning, you can still burn it. So then you can start to ask the question about where you have different vegetation types, because that's going to govern what you kind of do in terms of fuels treatment, paired with where your, say, operational constraints might be. And the bottom right, you can kind of see this idealized management description, again, just based primarily on where different species types are. A slope map, and then again, how we basically thresholded this to basically say, in this case, here's the terrain that we can mechanically thin. And the bar chart in the upper right is sort of showing you, on average, what's the % reduction of landscape that we have to actually treat. So this is the reduction in the area that we can mechanically thin because of that slope constraint. And it's a significant portion. This is actually kind of a good thing from our perspective, because we want the problem to be as simple as possible. And if there are fewer choices in terms of where and when to put fire, it makes the optimization a little bit easier to approach. So another challenge we have to overcome here is that there's kind of a lack of precedent for RX fire in some of these biomes, like pinyon juniper woodlands in some cases. Prescribed fire wasn't used very much. Like red fir, you wouldn't really see, certainly in subalpine mixed conifer forest, really high elevation, you wouldn't see a lot of prescribed fire used. So that's just something to kind of deal with and ask subject matter experts about, and fire ecologists that know a lot more about it than I do. Something else that we can do in these modeling contexts is kind of ask the question, what if we take the information that our model has given us as kind of an informative prior for how we can expand the area that we're getting exposed to, say, prescribed fire. Because right now with the Santa Fe Watershed, for instance, the kind of current and planned treatment scenarios really involved only handling fire and thinning in the ponderosa pine area. And so that's only kind of the middle swath of this, weird stocking shape. And we know that there's a lot of high severity fire that's going to occur up in higher elevations. It doesn't burn very frequently, but it also hasn't burned in way too long. So what we did was we took kind of a bunch of simulations from these various climate members. Here I'm just showing the fact that there were a bunch of ensemble climate members that we used, where CCSM, CNRM, et cetera, these are all specific forecasted weather products, right? Where basically they're climate forecasts. And we aggregate all those together to get an understanding of what the true projected weather might be. So we look at the collection of all of these, we can calculate the biomass on a per species basis in each pixel and ask the question, which of these pixels are dominated by species that we care about? So not just ponderosa pine, but what if we add Doug fir into the mix? We're going to go up slope a little bit. We're going to go outside of the zone where the current management decision makers are thinking, but we're also going to satisfy our desire to put more fire in the landscape and to use it as a tool to create kind of a more stable future for this forest. So just by doing this, right, on the right-hand side there, that black and white image, these are all the pixels where we know that the biomass is dominated by Douglas fir and or ponderosa pine. So if we start with that as the blue layer in the middle, and we compare it to the initial treatment layer that we had on the left-hand side, we can kind of end up with this expanded zone for where we're going to try and put some management fire on the landscape. And this adds a lot of fire to the initial prescription, and it was kind of making folks uneasy. It's about 20 hectares of RX fire treatments that we're adding. That's a big lift. It's not a very large landscape to begin with. But we don't need to treat all of those grid cells, just the ones that we expect are going to burn at high severity if they burn. We set this threshold pretty low. So this is if the probability of high severity fire is greater than 0.2. So if 1 in 5 fires are high severity, let's hit that with some fire kind of early on and try to treat it as well. And that didn't add a whole ton, right? So now in this case, we're looking at a fire rate of about 2,000 hectares per year or so, 21,000 hectares total. So then that treatment scenario looks something like this, right? Where I'm not going to step through this in great detail, but I want to point out that the initial sort of prioritized scenario, these are the initial kind of plans for the landscape. They're at 13,000 hectares or so, and we can bring that down to about half of what they wanted to treat. But we are going to put more fire in the landscape, and we're going to thin a little bit less. So by using fire as a tool here, we can remove a little bit less stuff, keep it in the landscape, but try and remove only the things that we expect are going to destabilize the forest in the future. Yeah, that's right. And we're using the fire return interval about 10 years, given that that was roughly what we expected to be historic for the area. And doing all the mechanical thinning, thinning from below, et cetera, over the first 10 years to get out of the way and then maintain that with fire. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but the same process we did for the Dinky Creek watershed. All right, we got this characterization of the probability of high severity fire across the landscape. We looked at the operational constraints bin by forest type. And we said, all right, let's just discretize how much fire we're going to put on the landscape based on the pixels that we know are most likely to burn at high severity, and then kind of bracket it down from there. We also try and hit those high severity pixels sooner, right? Because you can't do it all at once. We tried to split things up into reasonable chunks so that we didn't really freak out any forest managers, or burn officers. Looking at some of these consequences, that's the outcomes. Again, not to spend too much time here, but if you look at the no management and the no management raster in the upper left, and compare that to the naive and optimized, so A, B, and C up there. What we're looking at basically is the fact that the naive and optimized look very similar. And this is a good thing. We can look at the percent difference maps there too. So plots D and E, that's the percent difference between the average fire severity in that landscape if you do nothing relative to the naive treatment, or if you do nothing relative to the optimized treatment. And those also look very similar. And that's cool because we removed a lot less biomass in the optimized treatment than we did in the naive treatment. And yet we're seeing similar fire severity efficacy. Same kind of story for the Santa Fe Watershed. The no management scenario looks like Armageddon. And then the prioritized and optimized scenarios, we see large reductions, especially in the areas that were mechanically thinned. So that blue swath in the middle, that's primarily where the mechanical thinning for ponderosa pine took place. And we also hit the landscape with a lot of prescribed fire. In the optimized scenario, remember we added all those grid cells that were dominated by ponderosa pine or Doug fir. And so that's how we achieved this kind of upslope reduction in mean fire severity in this case. And again, it's not that much more prescribed fire being used. We're just applying it in areas where we expect high severity fire to occur. And there is a slight increase in high severity fire in the optimized scenario in the upper right. And we can talk about why that is. There aren't that many fires that happen up there. And when they do, they pop pretty big. So that's just sort of not something that we weren't too concerned about. But again, lots of discussion to be had there. So looking at the kind of the simulation stock and flux outcomes. For the Dinky Creek watershed, we characterize it this way. This is looking back at this plot, I'm not super happy with it anymore, but basically we try to look at the ecosystem carbon losses as a function of simulation time, right? And so I try to remove all the biomass we're going to take out of the system up front through mechanical thinning. And those are kind of the upfront treatment costs. At that point, we maintain the system with mechanical fire, or sorry, with a prescribed fire. So that top line there is the uninformed management scenario, the kind of the naive approach, right? We're removing a lot more biomass initially and then maintaining it with fire. And there's almost a linear offset with the optimized management approach. We're just removing less biomass initially, but the stuff that we're removing has been targeted a bit more thoughtfully. If you compare that to the no management, right, we're basically planning an investment here to remove carbon at the front end so that we can keep more carbon later on in the system by building adaptive capacity. And that was the goal here, and it panned out pretty well in this modeling context. The return on your investment happens 30, 40 years after you enter the forest the first time. So that's pretty cool. This panned out, and a lot of these treatments are being conducted in the Dinky Creek watershed, which is really cool to see. For the Santa Fe Fireshed, we did things a little bit differently. And one of the things I wanted to talk about briefly here is the fact that because we used the PNET succession extension for this model, for this landscape, and we could actually talk about the efficiency of photosynthesis of vegetation on the landscape. And that's something that maybe folks don't think about a ton, but if we thin forests and they were previously either overgrown or there's some water use issues, it's a lot of like contention about what happens in terms of release from competition for water, or there might be increased evaporative demand because now there's more radiation on the ground. Whatever it is, in this modeling context, we showed that by treating the forest, this zero line is the no management scenario. Everything else is relativized to it. So the time series below the line there is showing that there's an increased uptake of carbon by the vegetation in the system because we managed it. And this is, it's normalized here. So it's not like there's more or less biomass on the landscape. That may be the case, but this is basically showing that the stuff that's there is actually doing more photosynthesis. If we look at the emissions due to wildfire, this is cumulative wildfire emission in kind of the same context with that zero line as the no management scenario. You can see the same kind of story plays out, right? So for both treatments, the optimized and prioritized lines, we're well below the no management scenario. There's a bit of a jump up there kind of in the middle for the prioritized, and the optimized scenario is probably just getting down a lot more rapidly because we're finding the highest the grid cells that are most likely to burn at high severity. We're hitting them first, and we're including a lot of those upslope Doug fir and ponderosa pine grid cells. I'll also point out that it's costing us less carbon to do this, right? So if you think about, again, carbon as a cost, you want to minimize the cost of these treatments. The optimized treatment is leaving a lot more carbon on the landscape. And finally, this figure kind of wraps up the way we characterize the output or the results for the Santa Fe Fireshed. This is sort of net ecosystem carbon balance. And it's a way to sort of combine the three figures that we just looked at. Pretty much what we're seeing here is that there's a payback period for our investment. And the optimized scenario, after about 20 years or so, where we're suddenly at a net positive carbon into the system, and that incorporates the losses due to wildfire and management and thinning and stuff like that, and also incorporates those increases in photosynthetic efficiency that we saw in the landscape. And if we don't think about that, if we don't sort of optimize the landscape in some management capacity, here again, we use the probability of high severity fire, but again, there are a lot of objective targets we could choose. The payback period could be significantly longer, 20, 30 years more. And the goal is to get above that zero line as fast as possible. And even if there's an initial kind of requirement to pay more at the onset. So I know I kind of talked about kind of coupling fire modeling with other adjacent complex systems initially, and then kind of pivoted and started talking about the results of these two papers. But I think the thing I want to point out is that we only chose one objective function when we were basically doing both these analyses, and that was trying to find ways to optimize treatments based on the probability of high severity fire across the landscape. That single objective function has applications in a bunch of other spaces too, right? We know that high severity fire is most likely going to propagate further, has longer flame lengths, and is going to produce more particulate matter across a variety of sizes. So suddenly we've started hitting the likelihood you're going to intersect watersheds and contribute to watershed management problems. We're going to produce more smoke and kind of contribute to the healthcare systems issues. We also are more likely to intersect with other critical infrastructure like elements of the electric grid. And just to kind of wrap up here, that's some work that we're currently doing at Sandia. And if you would like to kind of look more about coupling wildfire propagation models with models that actually govern electric grid dynamics and ways to then make decisions about how to manage one system and look at the cost of the consequences in some other systems units, like, carbon out of the system to treat a forest to minimize the number of days that people have, that people go powerless or something in some portion of San Francisco. That's a very salient way to communicate these ideas to policy and decision makers, especially if they have to explain to people why there's a bunch of smoke coming from the mountains and there's not a wildfire. And that's something we have to deal with all the time, is how do you convince folks to be excited about prescribed fire when it produces smoke and their kids have asthma? It's a difficult thing to try and do. But the more we think about ways to communicate these ideas in broader and coupled contexts, I think the larger appeal your work's going to have, and the more diverse set of faces in an audience you'll be able to appeal to. And that's, it's pretty exciting stuff, and I'm really stoked to talk more about it if anyone's interested. But I'll wrap up there, and hopefully we have some time for questions.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, wish we could give you an applause. Oh, there you go. Some people are putting on the emojis. Thanks, Dan. That was great. We do have about 8 minutes for questions, and so preferably unmute yourself and ask a question, but feel free to type something up in the messages as well, and Dan can kind of respond from there.
Yeah, hello there. I'll ask a question. This is Tom Kolb. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Tom.
Okay, yeah. Hey, Dan, thanks for a great talk. I really appreciate the complexity of what you're trying to do. So my question is about how you go about incorporating climate change in the temporal scenarios. For example, the temporal scenarios of the recovery of the carbon balance that you talked about.
Yeah, so for the most part, all I've done is driven simulations using climate projections. So, we have access to collections of climate projections from CMIP5 and CMIP6. And for them, that's more or less what I'm using, just right out of the box, making sure that as years pass, the climate's reflecting our current best modeling guess about what's going to happen in terms of precipitation, temperature, relative humidity, that sort of thing. Now, in an ideal world, we would be coupling the feedbacks associated with the consequences of our management decisions into that climate system. But that requires kind of more of like an Earth systems modeling approach, right? And typically when you start talking about using community land model or E3SM, or LPJ, these kinds of capabilities aren't well suited to characterize the scale that managers and decision makers actually have questions about. Hopefully that changes soon. I'm sure it will. But that's kind of that's the approach that I've taken. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I appreciate it. Something I think we all wrestle about with is once we implement these treatments, will recovery occur, and say recovery of carbon stocks occur as we've come to be accustomed to in the past. It's based on past empirical data. It's just a huge unknown out there. So thanks for addressing it. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and I think the idea of fuel stationarity is something that the LIT has been recently kind of touching on. We talk about hysteresis in these systems too. And our models don't well characterize the likelihood that forests may come back as permanent shrub fields. We're trying to do some work to improve that, but it's a complicated thing to do. And now, unfortunately, we have some empirical measurements of what that might mean in terms of carbon emission, just because fires have been repeatedly burning over areas that burned previously, and we can measure it. But in an ideal world, we would have this coupled to a global circulation model, and that way we can actually ask the question of how treatments impact projected weather, et cetera.
I can go ahead. Dan, thank you for your presentation and really detailed work. So I enjoyed quite a bit. You answered a part of the question about the feedback issues and how does the treatment, and what kind of methods can you use to measure and integrate feedbacks. I think that's a really I mean, that's exciting, and I also like to see and learn a little bit more about. But you had also mentioned specifically about the challenges of ignition, and I'm particularly interested in hearing from you. What's the biggest challenge for ignition, and how important is ignition in your in the entire modeling process? And what are kind of ways in which, I mean, you've mentioned a little bit about how to get around it, but I'm particularly looking at human caused ignition as an interesting point for some of the interventions that I'd like to do someday. Thanks.
Yeah. So ignitions in Landis are tricky, because when it comes down to it, right, there's a probability, a number that something's going to ignite. Now there's a stochastic draw that happens that places the likelihood on a landscape, and then the fuel type has an ignition likelihood associated with that. A fire could ignite and then just not spread also. So in Landis, it's a little bit like an 8-ball. You tune the model to match our empirical understanding of reality. So that's, if that's what we're doing now, then the question is, what's the likelihood that as, say, the WUI changes in over time, or some kind of atmospheric dynamics change and lightning strikes become more prevalent, or infrastructure affords more opportunities for ignitions to occur in forested areas, how do we capture that dynamic in the model? And the easy way out of that, I think, is that I didn't model any infrastructure in these two studies. We didn't cover roads, we didn't cover power lines, and really what we should be doing is adjusting the likelihood of ignition as a function of distance from human trafficked areas. There's data on that you can use as well. And I think it would be a fairly straightforward approach to try and model, it's essentially some exponential decay as a function of distance from roads, the likelihood that a cigarette butt or something is gonna try and start a fire. Yeah, and I've been interested recently, and actually I'm doing some work right now with a student at UNM to try and characterize WUI expansion. And one of the elements of expansion of WUI over the course of Landis simulations is going to try and capture the differences in ignition likelihood. But that, because the way the model works, that's kind of encoded in the fuel layer, at least for the dynamic fire and fuels extension that I was using. There's kind of a human coupled fuel model that we're getting into that Rob Scheller has developed and hasn't been well published on yet, but it seems pretty legitimate, called Scrapple. And it's, I'm going to butcher the acronym, but the take home is that it's a coupled kind of human fire system. And I think they might have the ability to characterize changing ignition rates in that model.
Yep, great, thank you. I'd love to follow up with you sometime. Something of interest to me. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sam, if you're still on, I saw that you had a question earlier. We still have a minute, so if it's a short question, feel free to go ahead.
Hey, Dan. I'll email you to ask, but I was wondering about your thematic forest maps that you made from the tasseled cap and whatnot. I'm doing some work in Vietnam, and I'm having a really hard time finding reliable forest maps, especially at a high spatial resolution. And so I was really interested in what you said about these products aren't very hard to make and could be very useful. Would you say that's still the case outside of the US? Yeah,
absolutely. The only caveat to that is that the more tropical you get, the more cloud cover becomes kind of an issue. But because, for instance, what I showed there was, I think it was the average summer, maybe 4 or 5 months composite, you can typically generate a relatively cloud-free mosaic. You just may have to expand the number of days that you're looking at. But again, seasonality becomes less an issue the more tropical you get. So yeah, I'd happily share some code and walk you through how I did a bunch of that stuff. I think the accessibility of Google Earth Engine is something that, is worth diving into a little bit, because the dividends can be huge and you can use it for a lot of things.
Awesome. Well, I'll be sending you an email. Thank you very much, Dan.
No problem.
Yeah, thanks everybody for attending the seminar. If you do want to hang on and have a bit more of a chat with Dan, then please join us for the post-seminar discussion. The link is in the chat. So we'll see you probably in the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes. Just tune in, go grab a cup of tea or something, and join us. Thanks again, Dan, and for talking whilst you have COVID. We do appreciate it. And we'll see you in the next Zoom session.
Sounds good.
Okay.